Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed?
Can I make my site softer?
Can I make my site firmer?
Can we sleep cooler?
Sleep Number does that. Cools up to 8 times faster and lets you choose your ideal comfort on either side. Your Sleep Number setting. It's the Sleep Number biggest sale of the year. All beds on sale up to 50% off the limited edition smart bed. Plus free premium delivery with any smart bed and adjustable base. Ends Labor Day. All Sleep Number smart beds offer temperature solutions for your best sleep. Check it out at a Sleep Number store or sleepnumber.com today.
You'll get more than you expect with McValue at McDonald's. Like deals on your late night go-tos when the party goes till dawn. And savings on their faves. So date night always passes the vibe check. Plus, when the fam shows up for the weekend, you can show out for breakfast.
Buy one breakfast sandwich, add one for $1. Only in the app. Limited time only at participating McDonald's. Valid once a day. Must opt into rewards. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Hello and welcome to episode number 283 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Cater Cheek, Vivian Meldenberger, Heidi Tresize, and Bria. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is The Front Room. The Front Room was released in 2024. It has 4.6 out of 10 on IMDb and 41% on Rotten Tomatoes. Belinda, a pregnant woman, finds it difficult when her mother-in-law moves in with her. However, things quickly take a dark turn as Belinda realises that her new guest is a threat to her child. Now, as always for our film review, we're going to do our likes and dislikes, and starting with the likes. Brandy Norwood. What a woman. I actually think she might be potentially the most beautiful woman alive, to be honest. And that is not me judging her worth based on her physical appearance. But I have to say, she is the most beautiful woman alive. And I have a real soft spot for Brandy since her portrayal of Cinderella in the 1997 musical version of Cinderella. And if you haven't seen it, apparently it's on Disney Plus, and it is nothing short of magical. And I really felt like this film tackled some complicated issues, or at least tried to tackle some complicated and interesting issues. So we're looking at what happens when you get pregnant after losing a baby, because I imagine that's pretty monumental. What happens when you are feeling kind of undervalued in work and therefore that leaves you struggling with your identity. And also, literally, how do you manage shitty relatives within your relationship? And I, pardon the pun when I say the word shitty, it was not intentional. But when you've got relatives who are putting a strain on your relationship, how do you deal with that within your relationship in a positive way? And those are things I think that a lot of people listening can probably relate to in various ways. And I'm a big fan of taking kind of real world scenarios that everyone experiences and popping them into a horror film. Right? Because it's a great way to explore it. I also really enjoyed the exploration of religiosity and how people's religiousness can kind of cloud their judgment, and how difficult it can be to manage people who are like super religious if you're not super religious yourself. But also there was a real ambiguity about the mother-in-law in this situation, where it was like, oh, does she have magic powers? Does she actually have some sort of God-given ability? Because I don't quite know which it is that I believe. And I like a bit of ambiguity within a horror film, that we're not just being told this is what is happening and that's what you have to believe. That you're kind of left wondering which one it is. Is this old woman a bit of a charlatan, or is she actually quite powerful? And to what extent is that power just manipulation? And to what extent is it some sort of God-given power? And all of those ideas were definitely there within this film. The execution, however, I would argue, left a lot to be desired. The first thing I will say in my dislikes column is that this film is not scary. Not in the slightest. There was not one moment in this film where I felt threatened, where I felt anxiety or fear, and it could have all been there. If the film had been executed better, those moments of real fear and anxiety could have been there. Fundamentally, this is a story about the mother-in-law almost coming into the house in like a parasitic way. So she is this tiny, wizened, old woman who is racist. She says awful things. She is controlling. She's kind of, like I said, parasitic, coming in and trying to take over the house. And she's manipulative and she's all those things. She's trying to play the couple off against each other. She, was the catalyst for a very traumatic childhood for the husband in the relationship. There's a lot that's going on. But I think that they just portrayed her so badly. So when you were watching the film Weapons, which came out recently, and it's kind of not fair to compare, but the antagonists in both films are these little old wizened eccentric women, and the antagonist in Weapons was portrayed in a genuinely terrifying way, whereas I think in Front Room I just thought she was overacting so much that none of it was disturbing. Like, there were lots of bits of it, I think, that were meant to be disturbing, that her behaviour was meant to be disturbing and alarming and creepy, but it just never came across like that for me. And it wasn't even like OTT where it was like camp horror, it just was overdone and not done well. And I do think that elements of it were meant to be funny, but they weren't funny. And I do recognise fundamentally that growing older is a privilege, but growing older is also a time of real vulnerability and fear and a recognition of your own mortality, and your body begins to break down, and all of a sudden you become quite babyish in terms of the needs that you have and the ways in which people need to look after you, right? That in itself is a pretty difficult thing and has been the subject of many a horror over the last 10 years, definitely. 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of horror that's been centred around things like dementia, things like older people being unable to look after themselves and so on. But this film, I feel like, got it so wrong. A lot of the horror, ew, gross moments were all based around this old woman's incontinence. And it just kept coming up throughout the film. Her wetting the bed, her soiling herself, her having to be escorted to the toilet, and then we see multiple times the contents of the toilet. It was very much, ew, aren't old people so gross? And the way it was portrayed, the way it was handled by the main characters, a lot of retching, can't cope with the smell, really undignified towards this older woman, And I just felt like this isn't clever. This isn't good writing. This is just basically just ew, when old people are incontinent, it's gross. That's all it was saying. It wasn't saying anything else. And I really think that because, there was so many great themes that could have been explored in this film, and they fundamentally weren't explored in this film, that it didn't do anything. It didn't go anywhere. It didn't say anything. There was no kind of interesting message to take away from it. And because of that, these incidents of incontinence, there's also a kind of a bit of a cringy breastfeeding scene. They all just seem to be there for shock value rather than adding anything to a narrative or adding anything to a discussion about toxic relationships or whatever. And I genuinely think that all of the actors involved did well with what they were given to work with, but I do think that it was a badly written film. And in relation to the bad writing, so Brandy plays a character called Belinda. She is a black woman married to a white man, and his mother, who, moves in, she is racist. She has family members who are in the KKK. Obviously, tensions rise. She says flippant, awful things about Belinda, and she makes, casts aspersions, and And it sort of results in this showdown at the dinner table that is all centered around her racism. And I felt like it was so badly written. Now, obviously, I'm not someone who's experienced racism at all, but it was written, the film, as far as I know, by two white guys. And I don't think they quite captured what they thought they were capturing. So for me, you know what? I probably wouldn't recommend it. I will say that one of the stars I'm giving to this film is because it reminded me that Brandy existed and that she's the most beautiful woman in the world, and that I need to find that version of Cinderella and rewatch it. So that is 2 stars for The Front Room.
Ever wonder why you have insurance for your car or home, but not your digital life? Meet WebRoot Total Protection, your digital bodyguard that is built for real life. WebRoot takes the guessing game out of cybersecurity, so you can confidently browse, bank, and be yourself online without the worry of hackers lurking around the corner. With WebRoot Total Protection, you get antivirus that scans 6 times faster and takes up 33 times less space than the other guys. Identity protection with up to $1 million in fraud expense reimbursement and 24/7 U.S.-based customer support. VPN protection that hides your IP address, personal data, and location from hackers. And cloud backup with unlimited storage that works automatically in the background. With plans for individuals and families, WebRoot makes it easy to live a better digital life. Go to webroot.com/promo and get 50% off today. That's webroot.com/promo to get 50% off today. Live a better digital life with WebRoot, because peace of mind shouldn't be optional.
Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed?
Can I make my site softer?
Can I make my site firmer?
Can we sleep cooler?
Sleep Number does that. Cools up to 8 times faster and lets you choose your ideal comfort on either side. Your Sleep Number setting. It's the Sleep Number biggest sale of the year. All beds on sale up to 50% off the limited edition smart bed. Plus free premium delivery with any smart bed and adjustable base. Ends Labor Day. All Sleep Number smart beds offer temperature solutions for your best sleep. Check it out at a Sleep Number store or sleepnumber.com today.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, our story this week, we're going a bit off-piste. Okay, we're going to have a bit of fun. I love a conspiracy theory, and I do not talk about them often on the podcast because I feel a bit like it can get, you can wade into pretty problematic territory pretty quickly. But this is a conspiracy theory that comes up on my radar all the time, and I kind of like a conspiracy theory where we get to have conversations about what do the government get up to? Because they get up to some stuff, So let's just get started. Today is a day to suspend our disbelief and ask ourselves that question with seemingly a million different answers. What if? What if there was a different tomorrow waiting for us than the one we've been anticipating? What if today was the day you should have bought a lottery ticket and changed your life forever? What if the past is nothing like it has been portrayed to us at all? What if? What if by sticking to fact and reason, we've cut ourselves off from the possibilities of finding the truth? What if it were possible to have multiple versions of the truth? And to have more than one person remember a totally different series of events for one given day? I'm not saying that today's episode contains a lot of truths. I'm saying that it includes one person's version of the truth, and that maybe, just maybe, what he remembers is what actually happened, and maybe the truth that we've accepted for all these years has been the lie. Today's episode will be a winding journey, so brace yourselves. We'll be jumping from points in time backwards and forwards, and that's actually very fitting for the topic we're covering here today. Well, more like topics. Topics that, if the hero of our story today is telling the truth, were deeply connected right from the beginning. Our jumping off point lands us in America in 1955, when the US Office of Naval Research received a package. Times were different back then. An anonymous package with no return address and a simple message of Happy Easter would actually make it past the gates and into influential hands, and that's exactly what happened. When scientists at the base opened this mystery package, they were confronted by a single book. A copy of the 1955 edition of The Case for the UFO, Unidentified Flying Objects, by Morris K. Jessup. A practical joke, perhaps. The lack of the sender's name and address could certainly suggest that. Was this a prank by one of the naval officers, or perhaps from one of the three receiving scientists' friends? It was possible, but keeping in theme with today's episode, the scientists back then entertained a number of different possibilities. They opened the book, and inside it they found hundreds of notes and messages scribbled into the margins. Upon reading these messages, two things became inescapably clear. The first was that the author of this book, Morris K. Jessup, was dangerously close to uncovering the top secret technology that these three scientists were working on. And the second was that Morris was also dangerously close to revealing the true nature of the experiments being conducted at the Montauk Air Force Base in New York. Whoever had written the notes in the margin of Morris's book was essentially tipping off the US Naval Research Office and warning them that Morris was on to them. In a time of utmost secrecy and the ongoing Cold War, any leak of information was a threat to national security, especially if that leak contained information about breakthrough technology. The Navy wanted to know where Morris was getting his information from, and they also wanted to know the identity of their unidentified guardian angel. Morris was easy to find. He was a published author who was publicly announcing everything he knew about alien technology. But the person who had analysed his work and sent the US Navy that package was much harder to locate. When the Navy sat Morris down at their base and questioned him about his book, he was able to provide them with a rather unexpected lead on their mystery tipper. Morris recognised the handwriting from the notes in his book. It was the same handwriting as one of Morris's fans, a man by the name of Carlos Miguel Allende. Carlos, Morris explained, was a former merchant mariner who had been active in the Navy during World War II. He'd seen things that would blow Morris's mind. During their letters, Carlos claimed to have witnessed the infamous Philadelphia experiment in 1943. Desperate to gain any advantage they could in times of a brutal world war, American authorities had permitted a series of dangerous experiments allegedly based off of Albert Einstein's unpublished theories. Carlos had been there when scientists had pointed what appeared to be some sort of radar gun at the USS Eldridge warship stationed in the Philadelphia shipyard. The aim of the experiment was to see if they could use electromagnetic waves to shield the ship from radar technology, essentially making it invisible. According to legend and Carlos's letters, the scientists had fired the radar gun and the USS Eldridge had indeed vanished. In logic-defying accounts, the USS Eldridge had then supposedly reappeared in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away, only to disappear and reappear again in Philadelphia. All of this had happened within a matter of minutes. The scientists were stunned. But they were even more so when they boarded the ship in the hopes of conducting interviews with the crew who had been on board during the whole ordeal. What they saw then was a sight unlike anything any of them had ever seen before. Some of the men looked like they had merged with the walls of the ship. They were not cut down the middle, but were stuck with their torso and head on one side of the wall and their legs on the other, almost like they had been in the process of going through the walls and had become trapped. Others looked like their flesh and bones had become fused with the ship itself, their skin appendages, chunks of their bodies, none of them where they would usually be. The afflicted men howled and screamed in pain and confusion. Some of them just screamed because whatever they had just experienced had driven them mad. Back at the Naval Office, Morris explained that he'd been more interested in hearing everything Carlos Allende could tell him about the notorious Philadelphia project, especially seeing as all official records placed the ship in the Bahamas when the experiment was supposedly underway, and eyewitnesses were few and far between. Carlos, in turn, had written back to Morris saying that he'd lost all of his memories surrounding the experiment and encouraged Morris to read an article about it in a newspaper from Philadelphia instead. The newspaper didn't exist, and neither did the article, and neither did Carlos Allende, at least not in the literal sense of the word. It took no time at all for the Navy to track down Carlos Allende, or perhaps more accurately put, the man behind the alias. Carl Allen had in fact been a merchant mariner during the Second World War, and he had in fact written both to Morris Jessup and the notes in the copy of Morris's book, and then sent the book to the US Navy Research Office. Why, I hear you asking? Because he'd remained loyal to the US Navy and was trying to warn them about Morris Jessup. The letters had all been in an attempt to find out just how much Morris knew and then divert him from the truth about what was really going on at Montauk Air Force Base in New York. But what was happening in Montauk that required so much secrecy? What were former Navy men and scientists alike trying to keep from the public? We wouldn't find out until decades later. It was in 1971 when an electrical engineer from Long Island, New York, received a long-awaited and much-appreciated grant for a series of experiments. The Cold War was still in full swing, and the country was split right down the middle between those who believed in the psychic power of the mind and those who did not. Preston Nichols was firmly in the latter camp, and his new grant would allow him to conduct a series of experiments that would hopefully, definitely prove that psychic powers did not exist. Preston set about his experiments, and much to his dismay, and then wonder, he ended up proving that telepaths and people with psychic abilities did in fact exist. During his experiments, he'd come into contact with some genuine telepaths who were able to read his mind and the minds of other people around them. Preston had gone from a staunch defender of reason and logic to a bona fide believer in the supernatural. But during his experiments, Preston had also discovered that every day, during a very specific hour, his telepaths would be unable to read his mind until the hour was over. It was always at the same time of day, and it always happened. And this got Preston thinking. He didn't doubt for a moment that his telepaths were real. In fact, he'd been able to prove that their psychic abilities functioned very much like radio frequencies. And being an electrical engineer, radio frequencies were something that Preston very much understood. Preston then realised that a certain electrical signal would radiate around Long Island at the same time the telepaths in his experiments would experience difficulties in reading other people's minds. Preston connected the two, and then he modified an antenna on his car to help him track down the source of this strange signal. This led him right to the Montauk Air Force Base. A rather unassuming airbase with the usual turning curved radar reflector on top. Nothing out of the ordinary there, except the radar reflector appeared to be the source of Preston's mysterious electrical signal, that is. Preston asked the guards on duty what the signal was being used for, but he was quickly asked to move on and wouldn't get his answer for another 13 years. During that time, Preston continued his work on psychic abilities, and he continued trying to find out more about the Montauk Air Force Base, when he then heard some startling news. The base had been shut down. Over the moon that he was now free to investigate the base without any pesky guards getting in his way, Preston then raced over to see what he could find. He claimed that the main gate had been left wide open, just like all the doors and windows inside the building had been as well. It was eerily quiet. Documents, furniture and equipment were strewn about, almost like the facility had been abandoned in a hurry. Preston was more than a little unnerved, but this was his chance to find out something real about the mysterious signal he'd first witnessed over a decade ago. He searched the base and found what appeared to be the remains of some rather unusual and highly advanced electrical equipment. Then he heard someone say, "Oh no. No. It's you." Hiding and apparently living amidst the abandoned clutter was a dishevelled man. He seemed to recognise Preston, but perhaps more importantly, this man seemed absolutely terrified of him. Slowly but surely, Preston managed to get the man to calm down enough to talk with him. This man claimed to have been living in the base during the time of an incredibly dangerous experiment that had forced the base to close down just over a year ago. He also claimed to know the identity of the scientist who'd been leading the experiment. "It's you." The stranger had been shocked to see Preston Nichols walk right back into the base that he'd fled from a year before. Needless to say, Preston was confused. He knew that he had never been inside the Montauk Air Force Base before, let alone worked there and run secret experiments there. He brushed the dishevelled stranger aside and continued to investigate the base. And now that the Air Force officials were gone, lips began to loosen and secrets began to spill. Several of the people from around the town told Preston about the strange things that happened in Montauk. People seemed compelled to commit crimes only within certain 2-hour periods. Wild animals had once flocked and stampeded through the town. It had once snowed in the middle of August. It appeared that the town of Montauk was nothing like it seemed. But then again, neither was the man who suddenly knocked on Preston's door. Duncan Cameron was a strange man. He'd heard about Preston's investigation and he wanted to help. He needed to help. He just couldn't stop himself from helping. Something about him immediately had the hairs on the back of Preston's neck standing up on end, but it wasn't like Preston had people volunteering to help him investigate a former airbase all the time. Preston couldn't afford to be picky with the help, but he could keep a watchful eye on them. Preston took Cameron out to Montauk, where Cameron, much to Preston's surprise, was able to identify several parts of the building and the equipment that had been left behind. Cameron knew what the advanced technology was and he knew how to work it. He just didn't know why or how he did. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, as soon as the pair entered the transmitter room, Cameron fell into a trance. He didn't seem to know what he was saying, but he kept talking like he couldn't control himself. He talked, and he talked, and he told Preston that he had been programmed in that very room to hunt Preston down, befriend him, and then kill him. Preston had wandered too close to a deadly secret, and he'd almost paid the ultimate price for it. With Cameron now broken out of the spell, for lack of a better word, that he'd been put under, the two of them then set out to discover exactly what it was that the authorities wanted to keep buried. Part of it had been Cameron's very own past. It turned out that Cameron had been a young sailor who had survived the USS Eldridge's infamous disappearing act back in 1943. He wasn't as young as he'd been back then, at the time of never-before-witnessed horrors, but some of the experiments still lived inside him. His journey on the USS Eldridge had turned Cameron into a powerful psychic. Layers of Cameron's false memories were being peeled away and replaced with the truth, and the exact same thing was happening to Preston. At first, the images were foggy, like a dream, that you can't quite remember when you wake up, but then the memories fell into focus and everything became crystal clear. The stranger that Preston had met, squatting at the base all those years before, had been telling the truth. Preston had been to the Montauk Air Force Base before, and he'd been running the Montauk Project, one of the offshoots of the Philadelphia Project with the USS Eldridge. Over the next 6 years, Preston pieced together his missing past, found military documentation to prove it, and then went public with his findings. If what Preston says is true, then he'd begun working at the Montauk Air Force Base. His project was to build on the findings from the Philadelphia Project and focus on creating metaphysical and psychic weapons for the US military. To aid in his experiments, Preston inherited what was called the Montauk chair, a metal chair constructed in the 1950s that allegedly had the power to amplify the power of any psychic sitting in it. And his experiments were a huge success. With progress on a scale that no one had anticipated, Preston then found himself in possession of another military secret: the identity of one of their top and most powerful psychics. Cameron Duncan was brought on board the Montauk Project and often found himself sitting in the Montauk chair. It was then that Preston discovered that the chair allowed Cameron to produce physical manifestations of his thoughts. If Cameron thought of a dog, then one appeared. These physical manifestations only lasted for as long as Cameron could keep his focus and his powers in check. But they weren't the only advanced ability that the chair could put out of Cameron's mind. When Cameron thought of the past, a portal to that past would appear. This was a breakthrough quite unlike any other. Suddenly everything was possible. Everything wrong could be righted. Every mistake could be undone. Every evil could be made good. Or every opportunity to capture something incredibly powerful and elusive could be played over and over again until it was pinned down for good. Preston and Cameron discovered that those in power wanted to use Cameron's portals to gain access to the USS Eldridge while whatever was happening to it during the Philadelphia Project was happening. If Preston's team could harness that energy that had defied logic and physics as we know it and put it into a weapon, there would be no stopping the US military. Preston and Cameron realised that the experiments had gone too far and they were desperate to stop it. During their next session with the chair and with a portal to the USS Eldridge, Preston crept up beside Cameron and told him that it was now or never. Cameron, still sitting in the chair, then thought of a terrible monster and conjured it into being. The beast sprang into action, eating and devouring anyone it could get its grisly hands on, until Preston destroyed the chair and the equipment used to power it. The beast faded away, and so did both Preston and Cameron's memories of what happened. The base was abandoned, and until Preston and Cameron managed to uncover their memories, the experiment was mainly forgotten. Today, the public is again divided between those who believe Preston's story and those who do not. Either way, what was once the Montauk Air Force Base has been converted into a park for anyone to visit. If you dare tempt fate and risk a wayward portal, that is. Now, that is simply a whistle-stop tour of both the Montauk Project and the Philadelphia experiment, right? Two conspiracy theories that I adore. Do I believe either of them? No. Are we basing these entire conspiracy theories on the ramblings of a couple of men? Yes, we are. However, do I still love them? Yes. Now, keep in mind that both of these stories could be individual podcast episodes on their own, and even the Montauk Project could be a bazillion episodes, right? And there are lots of podcasts out there that do really detailed episodes on both the Montauk Project and the Philadelphia experiment. And actually, I was listening to a podcast the other day and they had like a Patreon special. It was a comedy podcast, but they had a Patreon special on the Philadelphia experiment. And I thought, oh yeah, that's a great story. Now, obviously, there is zero proof that the Philadelphia experiment happened. It is based on the testimony of like a single person who claims to have been there and witnessed it happening. But there's something about the Philadelphia experiment that really terrifies me. This idea that, you know, they were like, oh, if we can figure out how to change the like electromagnetism of this ship, maybe we can go undetected on radars, which would have, you know, made all the difference in war tactics and battle tactics. And then this ship disappears, reappears somewhere else for a few minutes, and then, you know, appears back in Philadelphia again. But the men on board are like, you know, melted away, or they're driven mad, or they're fused with the ship itself. Like, that is absolutely petrifying. And I don't doubt for a second that pretty much every government in the world is doing mad stuff behind the scenes. I mean, if you're Irish and listening to this, potentially not the Irish government, right? Because they're always doing just stupid shit and getting caught. But I do think, you know, big world leaders, there's crazy shit going on behind the scenes. Do I think they're making ships disappear and men are being fused with ships? No. I do wonder, though, if this is a situation where we're using stories like this to make the horrors of what was really happening somehow less to the forefront of our minds in a way. To give you an example of what I mean, or a reference point, when you look at stories about haunted plantations, for example, in America, you will find these stories, these ghost stories, that circulate in these plantations. Often there doesn't seem to be any basis for the stories, or you can't actually find a tangible witness for any of the stories or any of the ghosts or the activity. And it's often suggested that these stories exist because we can't bear the human horror of what actually went on these plantations, right? So instead we sort of allow ourselves to endure the horror, a different kind of horror and anxiety in the form of ghost stories. And during World War II and later, we know that awful experimentation was happening on human beings in concentration camps all around the world. And I'm not saying that people don't talk about that or reference that, because of course they do. We are very aware that that happened. There is something, however, about stories like the Philadelphia experiment that are so much more intangible that it becomes more palatable. And as humans, we like a bit of mystery and a little bit of drama and a little bit of magic. And if you're thinking, God, the Montauk Project sounds weirdly familiar, but I don't think I've heard of it before. Stranger Things was originally loosely based on the Montauk Project and was going to be, its working title, I think, was just Montauk. This idea of experimenting on people who had psychic abilities, and they then had the ability to open portals, etc., etc. And while the Montauk Project is likely not real, as likely being not real, 100% not real, that does not say that governments have never experimented on psychics, because they have. So the US government had a program called Stargate, the Stargate project, which ran from the 1970s to 1995, which was designed to investigate things like remote viewing and telepathy, and trying to figure out whether they could use remote viewing and telepathy to get an advantage over Russia during the Cold War. And that is a very real project that happened. And they were particularly interested in remote viewing, this idea that psychics could determine a location, you know, psychically. So you could say to them, I want you to think about the location of this particular Soviet airbase. And this psychic then would be able to describe the airbase, and then the American government or the CIA, whoever it was, would be able to find that physically on a map or geographically, you know, they'd be able to find the location. And it seems that they did have some successes, and not enough to warrant obviously keeping the project open, but they did have enough success that it stayed going for 40 years. And I think that's the thing with conspiracy theories that is always really interesting to me. 99% of the time, it is nonsense. But there is often a little nugget of truth in there somewhere, or a reflection of something that has actually happened. And that's, I think, the thing that makes them really interesting. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.